Good morning. Welcome back. Today is February 20th. And I don't know about you, but I've had an interesting week. If for no other reason, I aged significantly this week. And if you don't believe me, just ask my wife. She'll be more than happy to tell you how much older I became this week than she is. But there were other things that happened in the past, especially on this date, and let's talk about a couple of those just for fun. Because it was on this date, February 20th, in 1792, that the U.S. Postal Service was created. 1792. So ever since that time, neither snow nor sleet nor whatever has kept the mailman from his plight. But 1792, postage at the time was 6 to 12 cents, depending on distance. Now I think they do it by weight and not necessarily by distance. It was on this date in 1942 that Navy Air Force pilot Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare single-handedly shot down 5 heavy bombers in the Pacific during World War II. There was a fleet of 9 heavy bombers coming in and flying an F-4F Grumman plane. Lieutenant O'Hare was able to shoot down 5 of them. As a result, he became the Navy's first ace of World War II. He also was the first Navy pilot to win the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, Lieutenant O'Hare was shot down about a year later. His plane and body were never recovered. But a few years later, in 1945, the U.S. Navy named a destroyer after him, the USS O'Hare. And then 4 years later, in 1949, the city of Chicago renamed their Orchard Airport O'Hare International Airport. So if you ever wondered if you're flying out of O'Hare why it says ORD, it's because of Orchard when they set up all of that stuff. But now it's called O'Hare International Airport. I know most of us have been there. In fact, in Terminal 2, there is a replica of Butch O'Hare's airplane. In fact, it's the exact replica of the plane. I don't know, I believe it's a replica. I don't know that it's actually one, but that, if you know better, let me know. But if you've ever been in Terminal 2, you've seen this airplane there, and that's what he flew when he shot down 5 Japanese bombers there in World War II. In 1962, a very good year if you are planning on having a birthday. I'm just saying. In 1962, astronaut John Glenn circled the Earth. Was the first American to circle the Earth in space today. Now, Alan Shepard had gone up into space, kind of gone up, came back down again, whereas astronaut Glenn got up in the Friendship 7 and then circled the Earth multiple times. And I believe was in space, officially in space, for about a day, and then came back down. I think Alan Shepard was only in space for like 15 minutes or something like that, some very, very short period of time. So that was on this date in the Friendship 7 Mercury. It's a Mercury capsule. Now, I don't know exactly where this capsule ended up. I believe it's in the Smithsonian. Don't know that for a fact. I tried investigating that, but never could quite figure that out. But that took place on this date in 1962. Today is Mitch McConnell's birthday. Mitch McConnell is the Republican senator from Kentucky, also the Senate Minority Leader. So happy birthday to Mitch McConnell. And something that many of us might remember, today is Patty Hearst's birthday. Or I believe Patty Hearst Shaw or Patty Hearst Campbell. I think it's Patty Hearst Campbell now. Patty Hearst is the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. And she was kidnapped when she was 19 years old and a student at Berkeley by an organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army. So those of us who were around in the 1970s probably remember that. And it wasn't too long before Patty Hearst had renounced her rights and taken on the name of Tanya and claimed to be a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Some of you may remember this picture of her. And ultimately, she was arrested. And after she was arrested, she, they kind of talked about what had happened to her. Was it Stockholm Syndrome? Was it something else? She went to jail. Later came out that there was some abuse and things happening, et cetera, et cetera. So much so that her prison sentence was commuted by President Carter to time served, and so she was released. And then about 20 years later, President Clinton, on his last day in office, fully pardoned her for any crimes that she may have committed during that time. It's interesting. She did write a book, at least one, I know, and I can't remember the name of the book itself, but I know that when she wrote the book about her experience and officials were reading it, they were really thought about bringing new charges against her based on the things that she had said in that particular book, although they never have. So she has a couple of kids, lives, I believe, in San Francisco, and this is a picture of what a more recent picture of Patty Hearst. But again, that was her birthday. Today's her birthday. She was born in this date in 1954. So, all right, well, let's get back to talking about the Gospel of Luke. Today we're in Luke chapter 5. We're going to talk about some of the events there as Jesus is wandering around Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and meeting up with people. So let's get back to talking about that. Good morning, welcome back. Today we are here to continue our discussion of the Gospel of Luke. Today we're going to be in Luke chapter 5, kind of going through some of the stories about what Jesus is doing around the Sea of Galilee. And if you remember, I said, I think in the first session, that the Gospel of Luke has the first section is sort of the introduction, and that is like the first 4 chapters, kind of ticking off the boxes. Now we're into the second section, which is Jesus' ministry around Nazareth, or the Sea of Galilee, or in the northern area. And then in the second half of the book, we spend a lot more time Jesus' trip to Nazareth, towards Jerusalem. And so there's more of the teaching that we're used to, more of the parables and that kind of stuff in the second half of the book than in the first half of the book. And so we'll tend more toward talking about the teaching when we get there. Obviously, there's teaching all through the book, and we'll say some of it today. And then, of course, the end of the book has to do with the death, burial, and resurrection, the last 2 or 3 chapters, okay? But now we're in the section where we're just focusing on Jesus' ministry around Nazareth, okay? And Luke chooses to use these illustrations or these examples, these events in the life of Jesus to illustrate his message, and that is that Jesus' gospel, that the good news about Jesus is a message for all of us. It's a message for non-Jews. It's a message for outcasts. And we see how God uses Jesus' ministry to draw these people, or people like that, people like us, into his orbit. Okay, so at the end of chapter 4 last week, we saw that Jesus was preaching around the synagogues. And what he would do, as was his custom, as it says in a couple of passages, that when he would come into town, he would go to the synagogue, and being a traveling itinerant rabbi, he would be given an opportunity to speak. And this is a tradition that still goes on in a lot of different faith traditions, not necessarily Judaism. I mean, in a lot of areas, a lot of countries, if you show up and say you're a pastor or you're a preacher, then you're expected to preach. Okay, and it may be for a long period of time. Debbie and I took a class a while back where we talked to one guy who had traveled to, I forgot where I think it was in Africa somewhere, where they asked this guy to preach. Right next to, I think it might have been China, but they asked him to preach. And he said, well, how long do I have? Thinking in the U.S. that he was going to have, 30, 35 minutes. And he was told, I don't know, 8 to 10 hours, because the people in this country were so hungry to hear somebody preach that they were willing to come in and sit for that length of time. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to keep you here 8 hours today, I don't think. But be that as it may. So Jesus is going around traveling, and now in chapter 5, we just have a series of events that takes place while Jesus is in this area. Okay, so first of all, in chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Okay, let me stop there for a second. So let's get to setting. Now, Jesus is at the lake of Gennesaret, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so he's on the water's edge there, and he's talking to people. Okay, and as he's talking there, he sees a couple of boats that are up on the shore. Now, because Jesus is talking, because it's daytime. And probably most of the fishing, if and I'm not a great fisherman, but I know a little bit. I know like this much about fishing. And I know that most fishing takes place either at the start of the day, the early morning, or the late night. Okay. Middle of the day is not really a great time for fishing historically. Okay. So and if Jesus is there talking, there's people there, it's probably the middle of the day. So these boats are there. No doubt being, cleaning the nets and things, and we'll see. Actually, they were washing their nets because they'd been. And one of the boats belongs to Simon. Now, we've met Simon before. Simon's mother-in-law was the one who had been healed. Okay. Now, we know later on, and we're told that this is Simon Peter. The text tells us that it's Simon Peter later on in the book. Okay. But we know that Jesus knows at least one of these guys. Okay. So, and it's kind of interesting here, because of the circumstances of events. So again, this is not the first time there's a history between Jesus and Simon. So Jesus is there on the side of the water, and he sees people, and he gets this idea, and he says to Simon, hey, listen, can I, sit in your boat and you push off a bit so that I can teach? Now, the advantage to this would be simply that not necessarily for the acoustics, because if you really think about it, it isn't going to improve the acoustics per se if you're standing there with water behind you, okay? But what it does do is it makes it so that people can't crowd you, so that Jesus could actually get off the edge of the water a bit. And then because of the depth of the water, people wouldn't be able to just walk up and crowd him and, all of that kind of stuff. So whatever, Jesus says, can I get in your boat? Okay. So in verse 3, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Okay. It's interesting here. And it says people were listening to the word of God. Okay. And I think it's interesting, here when we talk about that phrase, they were listening to the word of God. Now, I wonder, because we don't really know, exactly what Luke means by that. Okay, so we know from John, the John account, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, we know that Jesus is referred to as the Word in other passages. So you have this double meaning here, that they were listening to Jesus being, we know from other texts and later that he's listening to the word of God. But I think here Luke is just talking about Jesus preaching, that Jesus is just teaching. So Jesus' ministry was twofold. That is, in terms of preaching and teaching. He would go into the synagogues, he would fulfill that particular moment every Sabbath day. But in the days in between, he would just stand up and be an itinerant preacher, okay? Kind of an open air sort of preacher. And over the course of history, you see there's been several different people who have become very successful. I know that was one of the things about Wesley in the 19th century, that suddenly he just discovered, hey, open air preaching. And that was, it seemed radical at the time in the 19th century, England, for Wesley to do it. But here Jesus is doing it, 19 centuries prior. Okay, so he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Okay. Verse 4, when he had finished speaking, okay, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Now, I'm guessing that somehow when Jesus looks at the two boats there, it's clear to him that they hadn't had much success the night before. Now, it could be, and again, Luke is giving us a very condensed version of what happened. It could be that Peter told him, said, oh, by the way, we didn't have, But Jesus says to him, okay, kind of in payment for letting me use your boat, push out for a bigger catch. Now, keep in mind, Jesus is in the boat here, okay? And I'm guessing Simon is in the boat as well because it's his boat. So Simon says, or gets in a boat. Simon rows it out, and so now Jesus is sitting there teaching, and I'm guessing Simon is just kind of sitting in the back of the boat, or in the front of the boat, I suppose, as the case may be, talking, as Jesus is talking. So then Jesus turns and says, all right, Simon, listen, you've been a great guy, so pull out there, throw your nets over the side, and for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. All right. A couple of interesting things here. Now, the word there, master, is interesting because that's used several times in the gospel accounts and in Luke itself. And whenever Jesus is referred to as master, you'll find that there's a connotation of question. Okay? It isn't necessarily a statement of reverence. It's a question. Like in this situation, Master, seriously? I mean, and there's kind of a connotation to, like, maybe today, I don't want to be too flippant about it, but like when somebody tells you to do something and you go, okay, boss, you kind of get this, all right, well, if you say so, and that's that word master that's translated master there. That's when that word is used. Okay, there's a kind of a flavor of a question here, and just like with this, Peter says, or Simon says, well, Master, okay, boss, I'm a fisherman by trade. This is Peter talking, Simon Peter talking. I'm a fisherman by trade, and we were out all night, didn't catch anything. It's the middle of the day, not a great time, but and Simon has reason to believe because he had seen Jesus heal his mother-in-law earlier, and so Simon says, okay, great, we'll pull out. When he had done so, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. So like, okay, boss, whatever you say, I'm going to let down the nets. When they had done so there's more than one person in the boat with Peter. I'm going to keep calling him Peter. I know it's Simon here, but there's more than one person in the boat. So when they had let down the nets, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Now, here, this is interesting. So where is the other boat? Now, did the other boat come out with them? Because remember, Jesus said there were two boats. He gets the one with Simon, and we know from Andrew, his brother, and James and John, they're all kind of a business consortium here. And so is the other boat on the shore? Did the other boat come out as well? We don't really know. They're within earshot because they get out there, they put the nets overboard, they pull the nets so they realize, whoa, we got a lot of fish, more than we can grab, and they're able to yell to the other boat, hey, get out here quick. Okay, so the other boat comes out, and so this is Andrew, I'm guessing this is James and John. So Peter and Andrew, brothers, James and John, again, we know this from other texts. So there's these guys, they come out. Where are they? So full they began to sink. There's so many fish there. Okay. When Simon Peter saw this, now this is now the second time that Jesus has performed a miracle in Simon's presence. Okay. He fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Okay, now they're astonished. Okay, this is a fisherman. Peter is a fisherman who is astonished at the number of fish. Okay, so if you come to me and say, I went fishing, and you show me three fish, three small bluegill or whatever, I might be impressed. Because I'm not really a fisherman. I mean, I have a fishing pole, I have a tackle box, but I don't really know what to do with it. Okay, I might be impressed. Okay, but a fisherman isn't going to be impressed. So with a fisherman, you have to tell go with me, a fish story. You gotta. It was, the one that got away with, kind of stuff. But so the fact that a fisherman is impressed tells you just how, like this group of fishermen, they're all impressed. This is like amazing. We are professional fishermen, and yet we're amazed at how many fish we brought. Okay, so again, one of the keys to knowing the extent of what's happening in any of the gospel accounts is to see the reaction of the crowd. Okay, you don't necessarily have to just take the word of the text and say, a miracle occurred here. You can look at the crowd and what is the crowd doing? How are the people around the event reacting? And that will give you an indication of what happened. Okay, so clearly this is a miracle. Clearly Simon reacts. He says, when Simon Peter, here in verse 8 is where they connect Simon and Peter, saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats. This is both Peter, James, John, Andrew. Andrew being there is speculation on my part, just so we're clear. So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. Left it all there and followed Jesus. Okay. So this is, here we now see Jesus starting collecting his followers. Okay. And his first followers are blue-collar workers. Okay. They're not the classically trained theologians. They're not the Hebrew students. They're not the sons of the priests. Okay. They're not necessarily people that are in the tribe of Levi or anything like that. They're just fishermen, okay? And yet these are the ones that Jesus wants because, had Simon said, listen, Jesus, I don't, what? I appreciate your effort. I appreciate your concern, but I'm a professional fisherman, and I don't, it's the worst time of day to go fishing. So I'm going to just skip that. We're just going to go back in. Do you think Peter wouldn't have been impressed? Peter wouldn't have seen a miracle. Peter wouldn't have been called. Okay, but because he obeyed, because having seen what Jesus could do with his mother-in-law, he does, and then he gets called. Now this is interesting because later on we're going to talk about other people who seem to just walk up to Jesus and want to follow him, and we think, wow, how come I don't have that sort of thing? Peter didn't either. Okay, Peter had to be worked on. Okay, and in fact, there's one of the other gospel accounts suggests that there's another event that takes place kind of in between here before Peter actually gives it all up and says, "I'm going to follow you." Okay, keep in mind, Peter had a lot to lose. Peter was married. Peter had a house. Peter had a family. Okay, Peter may have had kids. Okay, so Peter had a lot to lose, and yet he gave it up after a time for Jesus. So again, if people aren't rolling over right away for the power of the gospel, don't worry. Peter didn't roll over right away either. So now Jesus is traveling with Peter and James and John and probably Andrew. So at least he's got these four, I think. Okay. So verse 12, while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And the King James says he's full of leprosy. All right. Now, nowadays, it's pretty clear, everybody knows that the Greek word there that's translated leprosy basically is the Greek word for all skin diseases. It could have been leprosy, Hansen's disease, I think is what it's called now. It could have been leprosy. It could have been psoriasis. It could have been any number of skin diseases. But the point here, there's one point, and the point is that it was visible. It's obvious. He's covered with it. Whatever it is, it's not something that he's able to cover up. It's clear that he has leprosy. It's clear that he has this skin disease, which under the law of Moses made him an outcast. Okay. Now, I think we tend to exaggerate the extent in the New Testament times of to what extent people with these skin diseases were cast off from society. We think, once you had leprosy, you were banished and you were never seen again. Yet we see throughout the stories in the Gospels, we see lepers all over the place. People with skin diseases here, there, and everywhere. Okay, so they did get around. They were in society. They weren't. They weren't a main part of society. They were probably, if they had any official role, they were kicked out of that. So they weren't necessarily. It wasn't a situation where there was no hope at all or there was no contact at all. But they were kind of cast off. They were outcasts from society. Okay, so now Jesus comes in and sees this person. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now, again, Jesus' reputation has been following him. Okay, people are getting healed. We know that. He said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." So the man says an obvious point: "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Now again, remember, he was covered with leprosy, and I'm going to just use leprosy. He's covered with the skin disease. Immediately the skin disease is gone. Immediately his skin cleared up. Immediately a visible change happens. Okay? So the man acknowledges, he realizes, he recognizes who Jesus is. He recognizes and has the belief, the faith, the understanding to know that if Jesus says I'm going to be clean, I will be clean. Jesus, if you want to make me clean, you can do this. Okay? And Jesus says, "Yeah, I do. Go ahead and be clean." Then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing and as a testimony to them." Okay? All right. Now, what's going on here? Why does Jesus tell the guy to do this? Well, this was just the Old Testament law. Okay? And he says, listen, for you to get back in society, it's one thing for you to say you're clean. Even showing up back home with clear skin wouldn't necessarily ceremonially or officially or maybe even legally put you back into the city. And so it puts you back into the stream of commerce, as they say, put you back into your life as you used to have it. Okay? In the Old Testament, there was a provision for healing. There was a provision for to get back into society. And Jesus says, listen, I can heal this. I can heal this skin disease that you have, but I can't make society, or I suppose he could make, but I'm not going to make society accept you. You need to go to the priest and go through that process. Okay. Now, as a testimony to them, as a testimony to who? To the priests, perhaps, and certainly it would be. You could take it as that, as a testimony. Let the priest know what happened to you, who you ran into, or as a testimony to the importance of the Mosaic law. And I think that latter idea might be what Jesus is getting at here. But either one is fine, I think. Okay. Yet the news about him spread all the more. Well, why? Because you have this very visible healing. Okay, so this guy, wherever he was visible to not only Jesus, but to anyone else along the street. Now, maybe this had been a guy, oh, listen, there goes Clyde. Remember, he used to be the mayor of town. Now he's this. And all of a sudden, people are seeing the old Clyde again. And they're like, hey, what happened? What happened? What happened to you? Oh, Jesus. Okay, so again, what happens? So that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Okay, so here we see the beginning of Jesus taking on the role, not necessarily willingly, or let me put it another way, Jesus becoming a celebrity. Okay, verse 15. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Okay, so there's crowds of people coming to him to hear what he had to say and to be healed. Now, this particular text here, does not say whether any of them are healed. Okay, I'm just pointing that out. It just says this is why they came. Okay, people came to be healed. Clearly, of having just had this physical healing, that's what he's talking about here. Because now, in the story to come, we have another physical healing. Okay? So, verse 17. Oh, well, it's in verse 16. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Okay? Even though this is really a great victory, Jesus says, I need to recharge. I need to reset. I need to pray. I need to, commune, meditate. Okay? Kind of took a moment. I think there's a good lesson there. Okay? Verse 17. One day when Jesus was teaching, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were sitting there. Okay, so get this picture, because the next several examples all take place with Jesus and these Pharisees and teachers of the law. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem. Okay, so Jesus is attracting attention from influential people from far away. So even in Jerusalem, they're saying, hey, get up there and see what this guy's all about. Okay, and again, this is like a couple of days walk from Jerusalem up to where Jesus is now. Okay, so these guys aren't necessarily Jesus' friends. They're not necessarily there because they believe him. They're there to find out what's going on. Now, this is interesting, and here's another one of these kind of things we need to remember. The Pharisees are the good guys. I know, wait a minute. How can you say that? There's so much condemnation of the Pharisees. In the world of the Israelite culture at the time, the Pharisees are the good guys. They are the nationalists. They are the ones who are very pro-Israel. They are the ones that are very pro-keeping the law. Okay, this is a good thing. Now, to a certain extent, and Jesus points this out, to a certain extent, they went overboard in a lot of different ways. Okay, but they were zealous about keeping the law, which was the Old Testament way. Okay, so these are the good guys. And one of the things that you see in the New Testament and in the gospel accounts is you see Jesus will engage with the Pharisees. Jesus will go at it with the Pharisees. He'll say, okay, you guys, there's hope for you. And this is one of the reasons why you see several Pharisees, and obviously Paul later on, that actually come to him. Okay, Nicodemus, others. That's John chapter 3, I know. But the Pharisees are the good guys. Okay, and perhaps they're looking to see, okay, is this the guy that's going to lead us? Because they're very nationalistic. Is this the guy that are going to lead us into a revolt? Is he going to bring us out of this captivity? They're kind of trying to see, does he fit in? Okay, and the teachers of the law could be Pharisees, could be scribes, could be people that are experts in the law, and they're looking at the same thing. So I don't think at this point they're openly antagonistic. I think at this point, they're still kind of just trying to figure things out. Okay? All right, so this next couple of scenes, you've got Jesus teaching and the events taking place, and you've got these kind of guys scoping things out there. It's kind of like if you're ever preaching in a service, you're in a church service, and all of a sudden you get a row of guys that you don't know suddenly come and sit down in a row, and they're just sitting there like this, watching you. And if you're speaking, you're kind of wondering, who are those guys? What are they here for? What are they doing? As a speaker, I'm just saying, you're always looking at these guys wondering, what are those guys about? And so that's kind of the situation you've got here. Okay? And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Okay? Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. Why? Well, go back a couple of verses. They were coming to hear him speak and to be healed. So these guys are bringing this man to Jesus with the same type of faith that the man full of leprosy had. Okay, that the man covered with leprosy had. He understands that if Jesus is willing, he can make him clean. Okay, so that's what everybody's expecting. That's what, you bring somebody sick to Jesus, you expect him to heal the sickness. Okay. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd right in front of Jesus. Okay? Again, an interesting moment. Now, the roofs there were not like the roofs here. So it wasn't necessarily that they were doing thousands of dollars of damage to the roofs. Okay? And, this was basically a desert area. So you didn't have rain in the same sense that we have rain all the time. Okay? So the roofs were kind of thatched and they would be loose and you could move things out of the way and kind of, But even still, Jesus is inside this room. He's teaching, he's talking about something, and all of a sudden a little dust falls, then a little more dust falls, and suddenly there's a ray of light, and then there's a bigger ray of light, and then pretty soon everybody is doing this. We've all been in a church service, especially if you're in a large auditorium, you're in a church service and a bird gets in, right? What happens? I mean, the pastor, the preacher, whoever is up front, does his best not to pay attention to the bird. But everyone in the crowd is doing this. right? And so that's what's happening. I've got to believe, speculation on my part, but still, everybody's looking at, and all of a sudden, down comes this guy on a mat, lying on a mat, and he's just dropped right in front, placed, I should not dropped, but put right in front of Jesus. Okay. Now, it's clear to anybody looking around what's happening here, that somebody has brought him, this man, to Jesus to be healed. That's what people are coming to Jesus for, to hear him and to be healed. Okay, that's what they're brought him there for. That's what they're expecting. What does Jesus say? When Jesus saw their faith, their collective, that is not necessarily the man, kind of interesting, okay, but it could be the man as well. I'm sure he had a part in this, but the man and the men that are tearing apart the roof and lowering it, when he sees all of their faith, it's the same situation as with the man covered in leprosy. Sees their faith, he looks to the man on the mat and he says to him, friend, your sins are forgiven. Okay, not what they're expecting to hear. They're expecting him to be healed. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone? Okay, now, is that right? Is that correct? Well, let's think about the logic of forgiveness. Okay, forgiveness is where, confessing a wrong to somebody who was wronged. Okay, so if person A is over here and I offend person A in some way, such that forgiveness is warranted, I hurt person A in some way, I do something in contrast to what person A needs, harm him or her in some way, and I need to get forgiveness, is it effective for me to go to person B over here and say, listen, I really hurt person A, and I just want you to know I am very, very sorry for it. Okay. Can person B grant me forgiveness for what I did to person A? Well, clearly no, because person B is not the person offended. Okay. Person A is the person offended. So if I want forgiveness from person A, I have to go to person A. Okay, that's how forgiveness works. You go to the person offended. And sin, by definition, is something that offends God. So the only person that can grant forgiveness of this act, which by definition offends God, is the one who's offended. That's just pretty much the logic of forgiveness. Okay, so yes, only God can forgive sins. All right? And so when Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, he clearly is putting himself speaking for God, speaking as God. I mean, there's no question about this. Okay? And that's why, again, look at what the crowd says. This is blasphemy. He's claiming to be God. Does Jesus say, I'm God? No. He doesn't say, hey, guess what, guys? By the way, I'm God. No. But he does something that clearly only God can do and states it as a fact. Okay? He's not looking at, if I were God, I'd forgive you. No. He's just saying, I forgive you. You're forgiven. It's a fact. And the only way for that to be true is if he were in fact God. Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, why are you thinking these things in your heart? Which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, which is what Jesus said, or get up and walk, which is, as we said, what everyone is expecting Jesus to say. Okay? That's why he was brought. They probably weren't thinking of faith here. Okay? They probably weren't thinking of faith. But they said, they're expecting him to say, get up and walk. But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Okay? So, in other words, I did that on purpose. I want you to be aware of that. And the proof, and now what he's going to do, he's going to prove that. So he said to the paralyzed man, I tell you, get up, take up your mat, and go home. Okay, so it's essentially what he's doing here is he's like, the proof that I can forgive sins is that now I'm going to tell him what you wanted me to say, get up and walk. Okay, so if that's true, this former must be true. Immediately he stood up in front of them. Okay, immediately. It's interesting, immediately. Same word translated when Jesus said, I will to the man covered in leprosy. I will be clean. Okay. Immediately he stood up in front of them and took what had been lying on and went home praising God. Of course he's praising God. I mean, this guy just had his sins forgiven and he can walk. And immediately he got up. So something about the event. He either was lying there and there was no feeling from the waist down. And again, I'm speculating here. There was no feeling from the waist down. Jesus says, get up and walk. All of a sudden, there's feeling. Okay. Now, there's no explanation how long this man had been lame, whether it was I know there's one tradition that says he's somebody that had been injured in a building accident. Okay. But we don't know that. That's a tradition. Okay. So it could be that. It could be somebody who had never walked. But whatever, he not only healed him so that he could walk, he healed him and restored to him the ability to walk. So he took care of whatever the physical element was, the severed spine, the broken leg, the crushed vertebrae, whatever it was, okay, the congenital problem, whatever it was, that's healed, and he's restored, fully restored to the ability to do this. So, again, point here, when Jesus heals, he heals. Okay? Not none of this partial stuff. Okay? Everyone was amazed. Everyone was amazed. Okay? So, even the Pharisees and the teachers of the law here are amazed. And they said, and gave praise to God. They didn't really have a whole lot of choice because the guy is over there praising God. Okay? They were filled with awe and said, we have seen remarkable things here today. Okay, we have seen Now, that's a really non-committal statement. We have seen some remarkable things today. Yeah, so, each of the Pharisees went home to his wife, and how was your day, dear? Oh, it was pretty remarkable. Had some interesting stuff happen. All right, moving on. Verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. All right. Now, a couple of things about this statement here. So Jesus walks up, sees this guy, Levi, says, follow me. The guy gets up and walks away. Now, we know from earlier passages that many tax collectors had gone to John the Baptist. So is Levi one of those? Perhaps. Okay. We know through the rest of the gospel story that for a reason I don't understand yet, I've been thinking about trying to come up with it, but tax collectors seem to be attracted to the message of Jesus. Okay. And I talked earlier, I think, about kind of let's hear it for the tax collectors, or let's not keep throwing tax collectors under the bus here. Some of them were just doing a job. For whatever reason, that was the job they found themselves in. Somebody had to do it, and that was how they put food on the table, how they provided for their family. I don't think all tax collectors were crooks. I don't think by definition a tax collector was necessarily somebody who was always extorting the people. Okay, I think there were some honest tax collectors. Okay, and this may have been one of them. Okay, so we don't, it's speculation. What we do know is Jesus sees this tax collector. The tax collector, no doubt, recognizes Jesus, knows him from teaching or whatever, and when Jesus says to him, follow me, Levi gets up and follows him. Now, the second thing about this particular story is the question of, is this Matthew? Okay, and the reason we always say this is Matthew is because the Matthew gospel account has or the Mark gospel account, or both, have a very similar story about the calling of Matthew. I mean, it's almost word for word in terms of how it's described. Jesus saw a man sitting in a booth whose name was Matthew. He said, follow me. Matthew gets up and follows him. So in Matthew and Mark, very similar story. Matthew is the name. In Luke, you have the story, only Levi is the name. And so we look at these three and say, oh, that's all one event. This is the call of Matthew. And that may actually be true. Okay, but keep in mind, the text doesn't demand it. It is completely possible, given the number of times Jesus interacts with tax collectors, that Jesus went up to this particular tax collector, whose name was Levi, and said, follow me. And Levi gets up and follows him. And we never hear from Levi again in the gospel accounts or in the New Testament. Okay, we know there are other people following Jesus. It's later on we're going to talk about Jesus sending out 72. We always think about the 12. Maybe Levi is one of the 12, and Levi is one of the 72, and Matthew is one of the 12. Okay. Now, why do I think that? I personally, my opinion is that this is not Matthew, and my opinion of that is because less than a chapter later, Luke is going to describe the 12 apostles, 12 disciples becoming the 12 apostles. And he's not going to say anything about Levi being Matthew. Now, when he brings up Simon earlier, he tells us Simon Peter. He connects the two names. He doesn't connect the name Levi Matthew. Now, if you want to disagree with me, that's fine. Just saying it could be Matthew. Text doesn't demand it. Okay? Text doesn't preclude it either. Okay? I like the idea that Jesus just walked up to a series of tax collectors and said, hey, follow me, kind of thing. Okay. So where was I here? In verse 29. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors, perhaps Matthew, just saying, and others were eating with them. Now, side note here, in the Jewish tradition, eating together is a great thing, is a really important thing. Okay? In U.S. American culture, it's basically you get your picture taken or shake hands with somebody. To be seen shaking hands with somebody is seen as being a great thing. As how do you know these two are in accord? Well, because there's a picture of them shaking hands. Okay? That's kind of an American tradition, a U.S. tradition. Okay? In the Jewish tradition, shaking hands doesn't have that same connotation. Eating together does. And that's one of the reasons why the Pharisees throughout the gospel accounts are, and again, we're going to see it here in just about a minute, why they're always on this account. It's like, how can you eat with these guys? Because that suggests a commonality, that suggests a relationship. Okay? But regardless, so there's a lot of tax collectors, a crowd of tax collectors, a large crowd of tax collectors, and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, again, probably the same guys who were in awe over Jesus healing the man dropped through the roof, who belonged to their sect, complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Interesting note here, okay? Note what was said here. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law don't go to Jesus, they go to the disciples. Now, at this point, the disciples are Peter, Andrew, James, John. Okay, and maybe Matthew. Okay, but they go to the disciples. Jesus overhears the conversation, senses the conversation, whatever comes up, and then kind of deals with it. Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? In verse 31, Jesus answered them, one of the great statements of the Bible. It is not the healthy who need the doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Okay, and I think this is just a fabulous thing. Jesus is like, hey guys, if you're righteous, you got nothing to worry about. If you're righteous, you got nothing to worry about. I'm not here for you. You guys agree that these guys are needing, and that's what I'm here to do. So, and there's a side point is because, again, there is an evangelistic element even within the Jewish tradition, not so much that I'm here because these are the people that need my message. There's a side unspoken kind of dig here. It's like, why aren't you? Why aren't you? Okay. Kind of thing. They said to him, okay, now I think here they is the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. I think this is a change of subject. It could have taken place some other time. So it could be, I think it's right here. And since they're talking about eating and they just got shamed, they're going to change the subject real fast. Okay? They said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. Okay? But yours go on eating and drinking. Now remember I just said that eating together was a really big deal. Okay? And that's true. Eating together, big deal in the Jewish tradition. Okay? Fasting is a big deal as well. Okay? A lot of the ceremonies that they had, a lot of the festivals start with the fast or involve a fast. The fast usually was like a day-long thing, but sometimes it could be 3 days. There were ceremonial fasts. There were all kinds of different things, and it was a sign of piety. The fact that you would fast. Okay, that I'm not eating. That it was a sign of, oh, okay, you're fasting here. All right, that's a great thing. And to not fast, i.e., to not abstain from eating, was seen as being less pious than those who. So, and the Pharisees' piety, their adherence to the law, they figured they were lock solid on. This is what God wanted based on our detailed and complete and very thorough understanding of the Old Testament. This is how you live out the Old Testament law. Why aren't you living out the Old Testament law the way you're supposed to? Why don't you fast? Okay. Jesus goes beyond the letter of the law and says, basically comes back and says, well, think about why you're fasting in the first place. Okay. And I think this is kind of an interesting point, an interesting strategy when people say, our church tradition is this. They never put it that way. In our church we do this. Okay, we do this, but he says, "Can you make friends?" But Jesus says, "Yeah, well, here, why are you doing it in the first place?" Okay, and he answers, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast." Okay. So again, think of the purpose of fasting. Fasting is done in the absence of something, or fasting is done to call attention to something you want to have happen. Whether it's a blessing or a healing or something like that. That this element, this practice of fasting. Okay. Whereas the disciples, Peter, etc., have all they need right now because Jesus is there. Okay. So. John, where's John? John's in prison. Okay, so that's why they fast. Pharisees, I don't think he's even dealing with the Pharisees' particular actions at this point. Okay, but now he's going to expand on that with the first parable that we have identified in the book of Luke. Now, a parable, and I'm going to develop this more later, but a parable is a story, not necessarily true. Usually not, but it was a whole literary tradition at the time. Okay, so it was a way of teaching that would bring about a certain response. Okay, and I'll develop this more later. Okay, but it's more than simply just a story. It's more than simply just an analogy. Okay, it's a literary form very unique to this era. Okay, so from about 100 BC to 200 AD, somewhere in this time period, they developed this parable methodology of teaching. Okay, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of parables, and there are certain stock characters and there are certain kind of responses here. Okay, but usually they're stories that are designed to elicit a response of one sort or another. Okay, now here he's going to talk about. Now the question is, why don't they fast? Why doesn't your religious tradition, your let's call it practice, why don't your religious practices match up with the obviously correct religious practices that the Old Testament requires as practiced by the Pharisees? Okay? Jesus says to them, "No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one." Now think about garments in the first century, not 2022. Okay, now in that time, if you have an old garment, that old garment has worn, it has stretched. Okay, and a new piece of fabric would not have. Okay, and yet they're all subject to certain stresses. And if you were to put a new piece of fabric that has not been stretched, tested, on top of an old stretched piece of fabric, there's going to be some unusual tension in that particular, obviously depending on wherever this is. But if there's a hole, it's certainly a wear point. That's why you're putting a patch on it. Okay? So he says, nobody takes a new and puts it on an old. Okay? You just wouldn't do that. That's just kind of common sense. All right? And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, because wine has to ferment. And in the fermenting process, gases are released, and there's stretching going on, and an old wineskin will have already reached its capacity, and if you put new wine in there, eventually it will burst. Okay, so you really want to make sure your wineskins or your patches match what you're doing. Okay, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. New wine must be poured into new wineskins. So the point Jesus is making is that when you're dealing with old stuff, you want to make sure you use old stuff. But new stuff won't necessarily mix with that well. A new patch on old clothes, bad idea. New wine in the old wineskin, bad idea. Okay? New wine goes in a new wineskin. So the implication here is that between what I'm doing and what you're doing is tantamount to a new patch, old clothes, new wine, old wineskin. Okay? And what he's saying is you can't put the two together. Okay? What I'm doing is something different. Okay? So what I'm doing is something different, but, and here's an interesting phrase here at the end, and no one after drinking old wine wants the new one, for they say the old is better. Okay? And I think the implication here is simply that some people aren't going to change. Some people aren't going to accept that this is a new wine, that this is a new patch. Some people are just going to look at the old and say the old is better. Pharisees, what you've been doing is great. I'm going to continue doing it. Okay? I don't know. Something along that line. Okay? So Jesus has told them what I'm doing is something new. Okay? All right, so that ends chapter 5, this series of events that take place in the presence of these Pharisees and teachers of the law. Okay, again, we see Jesus reaching out to the outcast, to the man covered with leprosy, to the paralyzed man, to the outcast, eating with tax collectors and sinners, calling tax collectors, saying, "I want you to be with me." Okay, I want you to hang with me, Levi. I want you to come and be with me as I travel around. Okay, which is something no Pharisee would ever do, because a Pharisee, again, very nationalistic, very pro-Israel, very anti-Rome, and a tax collector would be seen as, one way to describe him would be as a sellout. This person is working for the enemy. Okay, how can you hang with that guy? He's working for the enemy. Okay, so next week we're going to get into Luke chapter 6. Again, Jesus dealing with some other controversies, talking about again things on the Sabbath, things happening on the Sabbath, its disciples, and then we're going to get into Luke's great passage about what they call the Sermon on the Plain. Okay, not to be confused with the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6. So, thank you very much for being with me today. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, again, email me, leave a note on the Facebook page, leave a note on the YouTube, or corner me next time you see me, and I'll do my best to answer it. So, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again next week.